Hi, we just finished talking about the aperture setting as one of the three different settings in the exposure triangle that can be used to alter or adjust the exposure for the photo that you're taking. The second adjustment or setting on your camera in the exposure triangle that can adjust exposure is the shutter speed. As it notes here on this slide, shutter speed refers to the length of time or the duration that the shutter is open on your camera. And the shutter works just like a set of shutters on a window, where it opens, allowing light in for a short duration of time, and then shuts again. And the shutter sets right in front of the camera sensor, blocking the sensor from any light reaching it until you press your shutter button, and that opens up the shutter, allows light to come in for a short duration, and closes back down. As you can see, there's a long range or long list of possible shutter speeds that you can set your camera to. The ones at the top, the ones like 1/1000th or 1/500th of a second, are what's considered very fast shutter speeds. The ones at the bottom of the list there, 1/2 second, 1 second, are considered very slow shutter speeds. The shutter is open for a lot longer duration of time, 1 second, as compared to 1/1000th of a second. So you can imagine at 1/1000th of a second how quickly that mechanical shutter opens and closes to allow light in for just that short duration of time. So also, one of the things about the fast shutter speed, for example, in comparison with the slower shutter speeds, is certainly because it's a faster duration, it's allowing light in for a shorter amount of time. So that's equivalent to having a small aperture opening, where that lets in less light. A fast shutter speed lets in less light by virtue of it being a shorter duration of time that the shutter is open. If you look at the orange box on the right there, it also talks about the fact that as you switch from one shutter setting to the next on this list here, so for example, if you're going from 1/1000th of a second to 1/500th of a second, because the shutter is open for twice as long when you switch from 1/1000th to 1/500th of a second, the duration of light is allowed in is twice as long, so you actually have twice as much light. So the exposure would be brighter by double. Conversely, if you had a setting of the 1 second shutter speed and you switch to a 1/2 second shutter speed, half the duration, you're going to end up with half of the amount of light. So each of these settings is essentially one stop apart. Remember, we said one stop difference is either twice the amount of light or half the amount of light. So going from 1 second to a 1/2 second is a 1/2 stop, or one stop, less light, so it's half the amount of light. Conversely, if you have 1/1000th, you switch to 1/500th, the shutter is open for twice as long, one stop difference, it's twice as much light coming in. A couple of other settings for shutter. You can set the camera to a B setting, where when you press the shutter and hold the shutter button, the shutter stays open for as long as you hold the shutter button down. Works great for fireworks, for example, where you have fireworks blasting intermittently in the sky. You hold down the shutter button, and for maybe a 2 or 3 second long burst, or a group of bursts of fireworks, and then you let off on the shutter button, the shutter closes back down, and you've captured a nice sequence of fireworks. The other setting here, time, is one where you press the shutter button, and then as soon as you walk away, the shutter stays open till you come back later and press the shutter button. This one works great actually if you're doing, for example, a light trails. If you've seen those photos where it shows the star trails, where the stars are a long streak in the sky, so the shutter is actually left open for maybe a 2 to 3 hour sequence of time. So this way you can start the shutter open, go back to bed, right, get up 3 hours later and come and press the shutter button again and release the shutter closed. Again, works great for those star trails, capturing those at night. Again, we talked about the fact that that shutter determines the duration of the light that it reaches. Although it says amount, it's really duration. And again, very fast shutter speeds and slow shutter speeds also have a secondary effect. Besides affecting the duration of the light, the secondary effect, as we briefly talked about when we talked about the exposure triangle, is that it affects the way motion or movement is perceived in your image. So if you have something moving, like your kids running in the backyard, you're taking a picture of a race car, sports, your child playing soccer on Saturday morning, any moving object or subject, it affects, the shutter speed affects how that subject looks in the resulting picture. So, for example, if you have a really short or fast shutter speed, that will freeze the action, stop the motion. So if you're taking pictures of your kids playing soccer, you probably would want something like a 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second shutter speed to freeze the motion, assuming you don't want blurry kids in your photo, of course. Conversely, if you want to have the motion of the subject displayed or depicted as a blurred motion, giving it kind of an artistic effect and conveying motion from that perspective, you would use a long shutter speed, possibly a second or half a second, for example. I have a slide here that actually depicts that. This was up at Silver Falls State Park up here, where I shot a sequence of shots of the waterfalls there at various shutter speeds. So we'll just talk about the ones on the two ends here. If you look at the shutter speed on the right, this is the way our eye would see it. Our eyes actually view the water as kind of individual water droplets, and this is at a fast shutter speed, 1/500th of a second, which freezes the motion of the waterfall. We can see individual water droplets if we were up closely. If conversely we used a very slow shutter speed, like the picture on the left is at a half a second shutter speed, it gives us that prototypical look you see for a lot of waterfall shots, where the water all of a sudden now is a blurred motion, so kind of an artistic look. So that's one side effect, again, the secondary side effect of changing shutter speeds. I have another great shot here that shows a pinwheel, all three shots taken at the pinwheel rotating at the exact same speed. The fast shutter speed on the left, you can see what happens at a thousandth of a second. It stops the motion. It makes it look like this pinwheel is actually not spinning, although it is spinning at exact same rate as the pinwheel on the right. So again, conversely, a slow shutter speed of 1 second on the right side, you get that motion blur. It can't stop the action at that slow shutter speed. You can't see the individual blades on the pinwheel in this case. Another case where shutter speed can be used to depict, kind of in an artistic sense, depict motion or implied motion, is using a technique called panning, where you actually use an intermediate shutter speed, such as a 30th of a second or a 15th of a second, and you move the camera with and at the same rate of speed as the subject moving by. So for example, the whole family here stacked on top of the motorcycle, you would move at the same speed, move your camera along at the same speed as the motorcycle, and press the shutter button down partway through that movement, and at a medium slow shutter speed, like a 30th of a second, as you followed the family in this case, they will be fairly clear, but as you can see, the background gets quite blurry, giving this kind of implied sense of motion. So again, shutter speed, primary effect is it affects exposure, how long the light comes in, making the picture either lighter or darker. And again, a secondary effect is it affects how motion is perceived or depicted in your image, whether it stops the action or whether it gives it a blurred effect, in this case giving it more of an implied motion, such as with the waterfall or the panning technique here. Thanks, and you'll be learning about ISO setting next.